are these controls in the bottom right hand corner of the screen where the camera is. First of all, we've got this little camera icon, and that will render our image. So if I just click the render button, okay, so here we see that the 3D view has been changed to the UV image editor here, and that happens by default when you click the render button. Now we can get back to the regular 3D view by either hitting escape, or we can just change this back to the 3D view, or change it back to the UV image editor where our renders are whenever we need to. Directly to the right of here we have a little slider that says 55%, and what this is the default render size in Sensei format is 1920 by 1080. So this is actually, when we render this at 55%, we're rendering our image out at 55% of 1920 by 1080. So this is very helpful for making a lot of quick tests, or if you need to drop down the size of your render really quickly to make a small animation or some kind of test like that. To the right of that you see a button that says frame step. That's also related to making an animation. So say you have a pretty long animated scene and you need to get a basic test render of it, you can increase the frame step here, and that will skip ever so many frames in your little animation, so that it won't be good quality, but it will help you make a test more quickly. But we won't be using that right now, but the slider, we can change the size of the render straight away. So there's a few things about this scene that I would like to change. One, I would like ambient occlusion on. Two, I would like something different than just a plain white background. So we'll be making a lot of smaller little renders before we get ready to do our big good one. Looking back over to our rendered image here, we see there is this little option that says slot 1. And if we click on it, we see there's actually 8 different slots. So if I were to click on slot 2, there's currently nothing in there. These allow us to make up to 8 different renders, and we can change their settings a little bit or move something around and see if we really like that render. So this is for comparing different renders. So for instance, we'll click on slot 2 here, and I'll check mark ambient occlusion. So this time when we render, alright, so that's finished rendering here. So now we have 2 different slots to view 2 different renders. One is a version we did without ambient check marked, and one is a version with a check mark. So if I change the slot back to slot 1, you'll see that a lot of the little shadows and shading, which makes the scene look a bit more realistic and cool, are not there. So if I switch back to slot 2, we see with ambient shadows and without. Now there's a hotkey which allows us to toggle between 2 different slots, which is great. So we can just click it and then immediately see the difference. So this is without ambient occlusion, and this is with ambient occlusion, which is much nicer. But ambient occlusion will significantly increase your render times. That is why I have it down here as an option, so you can make quick tests. If we hop back into the 3D view, a lot of times in Blender you'll have a bunch of subdivision surface modifiers on a bunch of objects, or multi-resolution modifiers, and these are all things that increase geometry in your scene. We have this button over here called Simplify. If I check mark Simplify, you'll see that everything immediately gets blockier. And this does 2 things. It limits the amount of polygons on every item in your scene, and when you go to render, it reduces the amount of math and resources that go into calculating shadows and reflections and stuff like that. So it's an overall fix-all for being able to make changes and tests really quickly, especially when you're animating. When you have a complex rigs set up for characters and things like that, and you have many things moving at once, it can get very hard. Blender can start to get really clunky when your system is trying to do a lot of work. So this Simplify button helps us make tests faster, both while we're in the 3D view and while we're rendering. So I'm going to change this 3D view back here back to the UV image editor where our renders are. The other thing I want to do here, besides having ambient occlusion on, is change this white background to something more fitting. So to change the background, click on the World tab of your Properties panel right here, and you'll see that currently it's white. And if I change this back to the 3D view, you see that there's just this generic flat gray background in the 3D view. However, in our camera, we have this more accurate depiction of what our world looks like. So if I click this World tab right here, I can change the horizon color and make this kind of a orangish red background like that, and I'll bring down the darkness of it over here just a little bit as well. I'll go ahead and tap space. There we get a small little depiction of how this world background is affecting some of the water and some of the things that reflect and stuff. And in addition to this reflecting the ambient occlusion, if I uncheck the ambient occlusion, you see it immediately renders in this small little area to reflect and not having it on. But if I check mark it, we'll see it with it. Using the render window down here to make small little render tests by tapping spacebar is great for usually for checking if materials are working or to see how something looks close up. But when you're trying to get a feel for your whole scene, it doesn't quite meet expectations. So I'll click space to turn that off. And I'll go ahead and render this scene, but I'm going to drop this from 55% to about 35%. So the render doesn't take quite so long. Okay, so if I zoom in on this a little bit, you see that I left the simplify box check marked. So our monkeys look a little wonky because they're using much less geometry. However, the render did go much faster. So always be aware of, in the top left corner of the UV image editor here, you see it says frame 0 time 0040.34. And that means it took 40 seconds about to render this image right here. So always be aware of how long your render tests are taking you, especially if you're not doing your final render, because this time will really eat up your project time. So if it's taking quite a long time, consider using Simplify or decreasing the overall size of your render, or doing tests without ambient occlusion on. Also too, you want to make sure that for the most part you're on zoom 1:1, which means actual pixel size basically. So you know that this is the actual resolution size of your image. I'd like to use a depth of field effect that we learned about in a previous video. So I'm going to change this back to the 3D view. Now down here in the camera view, we see we're looking at this small little monkey head here. And if I move around in my 3D view, we'll see that that is that head right there. And when I have it selected, you see that that is marked as Suzanne over in the outliner. So I want to create a depth of field where it focuses in on Suzanne's head and blurs the behind it. So to do that, all I need to do is select Camera, under depth of field and where it says focus, choose Suzanne, and then click Use Nodes. So I'm going to do a test render of that, but I'm going to go ahead and uncheck Simplify so we can see what that's looking like. Wow, that looks really amazing. So I'm getting really happy with where this scene is. So I think I'm about ready to do a full 1920 by 1080, 100% render here. So I'm going to go ahead and bump this up to 100% and then click render. Okay, and here our render is. If you want to maximize a window anywhere, you can just hit the tilde key. That's the little squiggly line key underneath the escape key in the top left hand corner of your keyboard. So if I hit the tilde key over the UV image editor, and we render this out at 1920 by 1080, and it looks really, really cool. So this turned out really well. So I'm going to hit the tilde key to minimize that again. And before we save it, I'd like to go over one other thing. If we click on the Scene tab in our Properties panel here, we'll notice an option for color management. So I'm going to use my mouse to scroll out just one click, and that gets me pretty much in full view here. But under color management, we basically have RGB curves. And if you're familiar with Photoshop, then you know all about these. So we can adjust these and change the lighting of our scene, contrast and brightness, and really try to take advantage of our ambient occlusion shadows or the mood and feeling of our scene pretty much here. And you see, as I'm moving this node right here, it seems to be affecting, far off in the horizon. So playing with these curves can produce some really interesting effects and really help you put some bang to your overall image here. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to click on image and save as image, and this takes me to my file browser. So you see over here I have several folders here, one for the desktop, one for library, where my library is and my assets and whatnot. I'm actually going to just save this image to my desktop. You can add these bookmarks. Say you click on your C hard drive and navigate to users, and then the name of your PC, which mine is Ghost Ninja, and then I could click on my documents, or I could add my documents to my bookmarks folder, or documents, or just put that wherever I want. So wherever you find a folder that you want to save and be able to get back to, just click on it and add to your bookmark folder there. So I'm going to select desktop here, and I'm going to name this Ruins of Monkey Island. And I want to save it as image type. PNG is fine, but here's where you can change whatever image type you want to save it as. And I'm just going to click Save as Image, and the image is now saved on my desktop. So that's the basics of rendering a scene.